Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with M.K. Singh, former super bureaucrat, chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, which has laid its report on the table of the House on the 1st of February, along with the budget. Mr. Singh, welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you.
So you're the man of the hour, along with Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Several of your recommendations were made to the government. Several were accepted, some not. Tell us which ones and which not.
The Finance Commission does always a balancing act,
Right.
which is what we have tried to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a Gogia Pasha, nor the Finance Commission pretending to be a sarkar, to take rabbits from the hat or conjure up money where none exists.
Mm-hmm.
And also the recommendations of the Commission must be viewed over a medium term, because this is not a T20 or a one-day match.
Right.
It's a 5-year report covering full 5 fiscal years. This is in addition to the 1 year which I have already given.
Yeah.
And so the core recommendations have found an immediate response. No recommendation has been overtly rejected, and it has been indicated in the action taken report that they would be given very serious consideration in the course of time. Current year, the fiscal pressures are understandable, but this is always has been the case that you must view this over a period of time and not in the sense of an instant gratification.
Right.
The instant gratification was given by accepting the 41% from the divisible pool.
Yes.
From the huge revenue deficit grants of 2,94,000 crore,
Right.
from over 4.5 lakh crores to the third tier, to about 1.5 lakh crores for the National Disaster Management Fund. These constitute the central components of the constitutional obligation of the Finance Commission, and they have been accepted in entirety. On others, none have been rejected and would be given serious consideration over a period of time.
Right. So I believe that you made 108 recommendations and 41 of those have been accepted for the time being. But like you said, the economy is broke because we're just emerging from a bad COVID year. So I suppose there isn't that much money to go around, especially to the states.
And by the way, when you say 41 out of 108, depending on the calculation, because there are always things like, take an example like the recommendation relating to a fiscal council. Mm-hmm. Now, Jyoti, these recommendations were made. We are the third Finance Commission,
right,
to have made this recommendation. And always is so that those which relate to changes on the regulatory framework, on many policy issues. Take, for instance, our chapter on resources.
Yeah.
Our chapter on resources makes a number of suggestions in regard to the GST entire restructuring. Now, it would be naive to believe that there would be instant acceptance of those, but the statements made by the Finance Minister and by the Revenue Secretary has said that these are matters in the works, and it will be really for the GST Council to consider many of these recommendations. So I would not count them in that kind of a category at all, 41 out of 108. 41 pertain to those 4 or 5 core obligations of the Finance Commission, which the government has accepted.
Right. So let me first ask you about the some of the recommendations relating to the farm laws. Now, these are politically sensitive in nature. We know that there's a big protest has been going on for the last 70 days. And you have said that 45,000 crores be given as performance-based incentives for states to carry out reforms. Do you think this could be one way out, a compromise perhaps?
No, I'm not looking for compromises. We were not greatly influenced at that time when we were making our recommendation this kind of an agitation was nowhere in sight.
Okay.
And the government had enacted the three farm laws, and we felt that this was the beginning of a bigger story on agricultural reforms, because what India really needs is to improve farm productivity very significantly. The farm incomes have to be doubled.
But that perhaps makes it even more interesting. Is that fair enough? This was not on your agenda when you wrote the report, but today it is. The three farm laws.
So listen. So let me complete it. So I felt that this was an ongoing process. What you required essentially was significant crop diversification.
Right.
What you required significantly was to move into agricultural patterns which were not so water intensive, but was more environmentally friendly.
Right.
And one of the criteria which you can see was on preservation of groundwater aquifers. For instance, we have mentioned that encouragement be given to agro exports.
Yes.
As one of the parameters. We have encouraged special attention to be paid to proteins being cultivated in this country, much larger quantum. So there's a whole host of issues of which this was only one component. And there was others which I have mentioned as 4 critical parameters. And these, incidentally, were incentives meant for those states. These are not incentives for the central government, because we felt that we would encourage the states, for instance, on agro exports, to set up an institutional framework which would encourage the export of value-added agricultural crops. And for that, of course, to make it competitive, we required a whole host of other changes to make our agroeconomics internationally competitive.
So but having said that, I think it is even more interesting today, even more important perhaps, that you find a way out of the agitation. And some of your recommendations are actually quite interesting, because you're saying that you're recommending to the states that the land laws be amended on the lines of Niti Aayog's model law to allow short-term and long-term lease of agricultural land. Now, that could be one way out, is that you're sort of passing the ball, or you're telling the states to take greater ownership of implementing these laws.
But currently, as you can see, many of these sectoral recommendations are designed, Jyoti. This was one component which you're reading. There are a number of other sectoral recommendations which are designed to be merged in the larger framework of restructuring the centrally sponsored schemes and the central outlays, which was one of the recommendations which we have made, and on which there is a categorical statement that work is very substantially underway. And we expect that many of these would be really subsumed under the new patterns and arrangements for centrally sponsored schemes.
Do you think there will be, though?
Yes, they have said that the centrally sponsored schemes are being restructured and rationalized in a very significantly way. This is also part of the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. And if you see the Finance Minister's budget speech, she has specifically mentioned that based on the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, the centrally sponsored schemes and the central outlays are being restructured and rationalized to make them more purposeful.
So there has been some criticism about the fact that that you have kept the 41% allocation to the states out of the divisible pool, which was also the recommendation of the previous Finance Commission.
No, this is not out of the divisible pool. The 41% is core component of the divisible pool. So let me tell you, there are 3 nomenclatures which are used. One is, Jyoti, and pardon that this may sound a bit of the economics type of statement, which you do not seem to be greatly endeared with.
No, I was just saying that we should make it, viewer friendly and sort of for the layperson.
I follow. So one of this is called the GRR. That's the gross revenue receipt. Leave that aside. So out of that, you get a thing called the GTR, which is a gross tax revenue. So the GTR for the 5 years on the projections which we made was roughly, Jyoti, 101 lakh crores. Out of it was really 101 lakh crores the divisible pool, 134 lakh crores was the gross tax revenue. You keep aside that which goes on cess and surcharge, the divisible pool comes to 101 lakh crores. Out of that, the 41 lakh crores accounts for 40 lakh crores. We add to it the grant component, which we have given 2,95,000 crores, and the devolution to the third tier, which is 4.5 lakh crores, then to the disaster management. So roughly speaking, you are getting to the figure of more or less balancing out the division of the resources from the divisible pool between the center and the states to justify the Finance Commission in using on its cover the two scales showing the center on one side, the states on the other, as some form of balancing it out.
You know, the states are already grumbling, and I'm not talking just about the opposition states like Jharkhand and Odisha, but even Bihar, which is your own state, you come from Bihar, but also an ally of the NDA government, of the BJP. They're also grumbling. They're saying that they needed much more money.
So let me put it this way to you, that we visited no state where they felt that 41 was adequate. Almost all states uniformly pleaded that 41 should go up. And in the memorandum of the central government, in our discussions, they felt that 41, in effect, it is 42 because I have taken 1% out for the J&K.
Right.
It is exactly what it was earlier. The union government's plea was that the 14th Finance Commission had already raised this from 32 to 42 in one go.
Yeah.
As Rangarajan had put it exceedingly well, who was a chairman of a former finance commission also, that 42% is about the limit you can go to. And the rest of the story. So the union government, on the other hand, would have been happier if we had recalibrated the 41%, but they have lived with it. The states would have been happier if this 41 or 42% would have crept up higher. So we did a balancing act. We felt that from the divisible pool, 41% was what was fair, appropriate, and just, considering the fact that in addition to this, there are large, substantial grants. Grants are not, what goes to the divisible pool is the right of the states.
Right.
Others, which are grants, are debited to the central government. They go out of what I call the vertical.
Yeah.
So as you split the vertical is a total,
Yes.
split between the states and the center. What you leave to the states is goes without any conditions. The rest of it, what you leave to the center, is a grant component, and it is not the right on the grants. So I think that if I balance the figures out, it roughly turns out to be more or less a reasonable balancing, combining the virtues of equity and efficiency and so on.
But, tell me about the grants. Are they supposed to be inviolate? The reason I'm asking is because colleagues of mine who spoke to...
It's supposed to be what?
Inviolate, in the sense, are these recommendations or should they be mandatory? Because there is, two colleagues of mine, Ramya Nair and Moushami Dasgupta, who spoke to finance ministry officials, have said these are just recommendations. For example, the 1.3 lakh crores that you've given to 8 sectors like health, school education, higher education, maintenance of Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. These finance ministry officials are saying, we don't have the money. हमारे पास कोई पैसा वैसा नहीं है. These are recommendations. अभी देखते हैं क्या होगा बाद में.
Fair enough. So, if I were in the Ministry of Finance, I wouldn't have spoken a different language. So, so let's put it this way, that no, what I'm saying is that they have accepted 2,95,000 crore as revenue deficit grant. It's a grant
Mhm.
under Article 275. What they have accepted is 4.5 lakh crores for the third tier. That's a grant. That's not a right. What they have accepted is the funds for the national disaster management. That's a grant. That's not a right. So if you add all these three, then out of the 10 lakh crores of grant, in addition to 40 lakh crores, which has roughly gone under the 41% formula, you find that there's only that two components, one on the sector-specific recommendations and the other on state-specific recommendations. On the state-specific recommendations, they have said that they would give this a very due consideration. On the others, they have said that this will be considered in the context of the rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes. So I would say that they have been reasonable and fair in assigning the grants as recommended by us and consistent with the overall obligations under the Constitution.
Right. So speaking of non-lapsable funds, you've recommended a non-lapsable modernization fund for defense and internal security for 2.38 lakh crores over 5 years. And while the government has in principle within code said yes, but actually, again, sources are saying, again, to my colleagues, Ramya and Moshimi, that they may not be able to do it.
So the point is this, that the non-lapsable fund has been accepted, which is the main thing.
Yeah.
For the first time after maybe decades of lead by the Ministry of Defense, they have accepted the concept of a non-lapsable fund. On a financing module, we have suggested one financing module, and if they wish to have variations on the financing module, that is something which I believe is quite appropriate, because for instance, on the land monetization of defense land, or for the payment of outstanding dues which are there from defense, or for instance, on public sector undertakings within the defense ministry, the resources out of that. I mean, there are generic statements that on the whole asset monetization, including the land assets monetization, they're having a very careful look at that, and depending on what is the most appropriate financing module. But the acceptance of a non-lapsable fund, in my view, is a quantum change in the thinking and of the Ministry of Finance in managing the capital expenditure for defense.
But in this particular case, on the defense case, in the budget, if you look at the budget, the defense budget has gone up only by 1.4 crores. And if in fact, it's when you sort of take everything else out, it's like a paltry 500 crore rupees. So perhaps this defense fund that you proposed could be one way out of satisfying both sides.
So this defense fund, which we have proposed, and by the way, it includes Ministry of Home Affairs also. It says internal security. Yeah. It's modernization of defense and internal security as well. Right. So it is both. Now, the point is this, that what was the driving philosophy behind our recommendation? This was to overcome a mismatch which has existed between capital expenditure requirements and the availability of finances. Finances are there. The procurement cycle, which is a tardy procurement cycle, may not be ready to make purposeful utilization. And the non-lapsable fund is therefore designed to give predictability and certainty for a better congruence between the procurement cycle and the availability of finance. This is an important tenet when it comes to predictability in the acquisition of capital expenditure for defense, for both domestically and for purposes. And for the Home Ministry, for equally for the paramilitary forces, which also require upgradation.
But if you're not, if the sources of funding are being dried up because we're just emerging from a COVID year, where are you going to get the money from?
Well, I think that there's a proposal there. Many of the assets of the defense are frozen. You need to monetize them. One of them, two of them, for instance, to give you, defense is perhaps the biggest landlord in this country.
Yeah.
They are sitting on land which can be put to greater and more economic use. You are having public sector undertakings whose disinvestments would improve the productivity of the overall. It would also free up resources. So I think that there are innovative ways in which the financing of this can be really addressed over a medium term. And the concept of a non-lapsable fund in the public accounts, in my view, is a quantum change in the thinking in this process.
On the sale of defense lands, and like you said, they are the biggest landlords in this country. I think the finance ministry is being, or perhaps even the defense ministry is being quite circumspect about that, because although they were willing to look at it earlier, but it seems to me now that they're pulling back on that.
I have no idea of the dynamics of thinking. We have made our recommendations, and we have made them after a process. The Defense Ministry recommendations were done by a group under my chairmanship, which both had Finance Ministry. The current Expenditure Secretary was a member of that group, and so is the current Defense Secretary was a member of the group. And these suggestions and recommendations have emanated from out of that thinking of that interministerial group.
Tell me about the 8,000 crore grant to the Housing and Urban Affairs Ministry to create 8 new cities or incubate 8 new cities.
That's correct. I think that one of the lessons which the Commission drew from the pandemic is that cities which were highly congested were prone to infection, were prone to transmission of diseases. They needed to spread out the population in a more calibrated way. And one way is to really disperse it by creating new cities. In any case, I think that apart from one or two efforts to create a new city, Amravati is one which took off, now taken off into controversies of different kinds. The Hyderabad city, which Babu had done, the Greater Hyderabad, creating a city. So there is a need to catalyze, promote, and incentivize the creation of new cities in this country. And we felt that this was one way in which the Ministry of Urban Development, who, by the way, as you would have seen, has welcomed this in a very significant way by successive statements that this was a great initiative which would enable the rejuvenation, not but creation of new cities which are needed.
Also, this could jumpstart growth as you emerge from a COVID year, right?
New construction activity, new purpose, new objective, catalyzing more private entrepreneurial energy inherent. And you can see many parts of India are very, very highly congested. And I think that that's one obvious lesson which the pandemic has given to this country. But even apart from the pandemic, you certainly need many more new cities, given the size of our demography and the congested way in which we are now.
Yeah, because we haven't thought about this since independence. I mean, people are moving from the villages to urban centers, but urban centers are increasingly becoming slums rather than being developed in modern ways.
True.
So my last couple of questions on the fiscal deficit. This year, it's expected to be about over 9%. But you're recommending that over the next 5 years, it be brought down gradually.
Right. So we have in our Finance Commission's recommendation given a fiscal trajectory both for the union and a fiscal trajectory for the states. We have not given a fixed point. We have given a range in respect of both. And so as far as the states are concerned, we have said that they be allowed 1% extra for next year. And then they be allowed 0.5% for the power sector. And it was conditional on undertaking certain power reforms. The headroom for borrowing we increased by 0.5%. So it would be 4% or 0.5%, and thereafter gradually come down to levels which they had accepted in their own state level FRBM acts. And the finance minister has accepted this, my recommendation, as far as the states are concerned in toto. As far as the central government is concerned, they have recalibrated. They're looking at expenditure pressures, a somewhat more elevated fiscal deficit numbers than we had projected. But then we had made rather conservative projection on growth also. And if growth grows up, there can be no other way to discharge your debt obligation than to enhance growth. We have also recommended that given all the changes which have taken place, the FRBM Act, first one, and then the second one, which was based on the recommendations of a committee chaired by me, needs a fundamental revisit. We need to reset the fiscal contours, both in terms of debt and in terms of the fiscal deficit parameter, because what is important is to have sustainable levels of debt for the general government, Jyoti. Now, one of the things which in the past has occupied is that we have concentrated too much on the central government. The state governments have been left out of the picture. And you cannot have a meaningful fiscal architecture in which the states do not become active partners. We have therefore made some recommendations in regard to how this could be brought about. And they have said that these recommendations would be examined.
So you've said also that states should have their own planning commissions, for example.
I haven't said that.
No, not here, but elsewhere. You've said elsewhere.
I never said that. I've said a different thing. I've said that they need to have their own kind of some entity to advise them on fiscal matters, not a planning commission. Planning commission has been relegated to history. We had no intentions
Niti Aayog.
resurrecting that.
So their own versions of the Niti Aayog, I suppose.
No, I suppose not.
Okay.
Depending on the objective, because the objective here is a very limited one, that they need to have a fiscal cell perhaps in the state, but the objective is really in relation to the features of debt and fiscal deficit for each individual state. And we have, as you see, in volume 4, which is an exclusive volume, entirely devoted to states, we have done a very detailed analysis of each state and given unique disaggregated path for both debt and fiscal deficit for purposes of achieving macroeconomic stability for the states as a whole. Because as you know, unlike other countries, there is no such thing as sub-sovereign bankruptcy. California can go bust or some other state can go bust. But here, as there is an implicit sovereign guarantee, and that is why recourse to Article 293 of the Constitution is a check on this kind of a profligacy which will destabilize the states. So all this have to be taken into context before we arrive at conclusions which would be appropriate. But we have made recommendations. The need for both the center and the states to act in close concert and in partnership to have a meaningful framework for both debt and fiscal deficit, two important ingredients of macroeconomic stability.
So I can't let you go without asking you about the budget that was presented along with the Finance Commission's report, which is that lots of public sector undertakings are being divested to create the space, if you like, to kickstart growth. Do you think that this turn towards the right by the Modi government is is finishing what the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government started, of which you were a key part.
Well, I must say that this is a quantum change in terms of mindset and attitudes. This is realizing the need for the fact that you cannot be trapped in the past. Realizing the fact that India was left behind while the rest of Asia, China, shot ahead with much higher rates of growth. If we look at long-term historical trends, India till about the early 70s had per capita income not very different than the per capita income of, let's say, China. But China began its economic reform programs in 1974. We began it only under the compulsions of the balance of payments crisis in 1991.
Right.
And thereafter, with the changes then which were necessary to address the crisis, we allowed ourselves to again go back into an era of complacency. The regime of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, which you mentioned, did bring about a change by bringing in changes in the way in which the infrastructure was addressed, particularly the road connectivity program, in which freed up the telecom. And those were two very important, enacted the FRBM Act. And these were very important changes. But thereafter, I think that we got again trapped in the mindset. So for instance, I don't know if you recall that for the first time, people were scared to use the word disinvestment. When Manmohan Singh, even disinvestment, Manmohan Singh in 1991 had used the peculiar word bundle of shares. From bundle of shares, we somehow reluctantly came around to using the word disinvestment. But we fought shy of embracing what it really meant, namely privatization. Embracing, therefore, the role of private capital in a significant way represents a very important mindset change. And let me say, Jyoti, it is more difficult to undo the past than to chart the future. We were trapped in the post-bank nationalization era of not wanting to touch the issue of bank ownership because the Congress party had sentimental attachment to the way in which the bank nationalization had taken place. I have dealt with all this extensively in my book too.
Yeah.
Equally in terms of the regulatory framework, which really trapped our public sector undertakings, and the micromanagement of decision making in the bank, telephone culture, micromanaging the decisions in the public sector undertaking, which really meant that the assets which were embedded were not giving you the kind of returns which they should. And this budget, therefore, in some sense, in trying to rewrite the past and chart out a future, is a historical change which represents a quantum shift in the way in which the contours of our economic growth are designed to be written.
But if you're unleashing the animal spirits for a second time, and of course, Dr. Manmohan Singh's era did that some years ago, why is there a reluctance to engage with the rest of the world? And I'm asking why India did not join the RCEP, for instance. And especially now, if you see that the new Joe Biden administration is likely to go back to its Trans-Pacific Partnership, which means that the rest of the world, or large parts of the rest of the world, are going to be part of this big trading bloc, and India will be out of it.
Let me say that I don't think that we have ever said that India would like to re-embrace protectionism in the narrow sense of the term. I think that we should bring in several factors, of which geopolitics must be a very important factor. And I've had presentations made to me credibly by the Ministry of Finance, which said that many of these smaller bilateral free trade agreements, really given opaqueness on the rules of origin, were proving highly deleterious to us. But we have kept our mind open on two things. One, we would certainly like the multilateral international framework, the WTO, to be invigorated. India is always better off in a multilateral world. We feel very comfortable. It was the earlier administration which stymied the role of the WTO, and we would greatly welcome this initiative of the Biden government in investing life back into the only trading multilateral institution which we have, namely the WTO. Mm-hmm. Second, I think that we have kept our mind completely open in regard to broader regional agreements. Our dialogue with Europe for a European trade agreement has made some progress with the US. If the US is embarking on a trans-Pacific and so on, those are issues on which we have kept certainly our mind open. India has not embraced unmitigated protectionism. We recognize the importance of trade as an engine of growth. The Prime Minister the other day repeatedly said that India would like to become an integral part of the global value-added chain. And becoming part of the global value-added chain is nothing but embracing trade as an engine of growth and employment.
So India could still join the RCEP?
Well, the point is RCEP has kept the doors open, but we have to evaluate the most optimum option.
Right. On this note, Mr. Singh, thank you so much for your time, for explaining what the Finance Commission recommendations were about. And we hope and we will watch and see how this story unfolds. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you.